Okay, it's just a short introduction to activity-based costing. So typically, when we talk about allocating overhead, we usually use a single rate, either called a predetermined overhead rate or a plant-wide rate. And I'll talk about that in a separate video. But right now, I want to talk about how we utilize activity-based costing. So activity-based costing effectively breaks down our process into more detail for more accurate costing analysis. So rather than taking, one big, large amount of overhead and taking a single activity base to allocate that overhead, we can break down our overhead our processes that are included in the cost, the overall cost of overhead, and break them down individually and more accurately allocate those costs based on activity consumption, how much each product or each area or whatever our activity driver is, how much it actually, takes up of each individual overhead activity. So activities themselves are types of work or actions involved in the manufacturing process or service activity. Activity base is the measure of the activity that's related to the change in cost, used in analyzing and classifying cost behavior. Activity bases are also used as the denominator in calculating the predetermined overhead rate to assign overhead costs to cost objects. The activity rates is the estimated activity cost divided by the estimated activity. So this would be how I find a given rate for a given overhead activity. And then activity-based costing is this alternative approach we're going to learn about in this chapter for allocating factory overhead that uses multiple rates based on the activities that are required to produce that product. So rather than just taking one large number, dividing it by one single activity base, we're going to individually separate out those activities and divide by the given total amount of that activity to more accurately allocate those costs. So for example here, when I've got my deluxe model, I've got my regular model, I've got how many units of each one I produced, I've got my prime cost, my direct labor hours, my machine hours, my setup hours. If I were going to do this as an overall, I would take this, and these are all my overhead activities, by the way. If I was going to do this overall with a predetermined overhead rate or a plant-wide overhead rate, I would choose one of these activity bases, and I would divide it by this total amount and just allocate based on that one single item. Whereas if with activity-based costing, I'm going to take each one of these overhead activities individually and find an allocation base or a consumption ratio, depending on how you want to do it, and I'm going to allocate individually based on that. So that's all I want to say in this first video. I'll put some actual numbers in the next video. We'll figure a consumption ratio and we'll figure activity rates and activity drivers in the next video.